I love pads. Long ones, short ones, weird ones with little tinkly bits, ones with crazy bits, spooky ones, pretty ones, all of them. For me, the pad is one of the apex predators of the synthesizer world. Powerful enough to act as an entire cue in a movie, enough to drive the emotion of an entire scene, or smart enough to know when to sit back and let other instruments do the heavy lifting, all the while knowing that those other instruments would be nothing without the pad. Growing up in the 90s and 2000s, I heard a lot of pads from a very specific type of synthesizer, the Rompler. I may not have known it at the time, but the Rompler was unbelievably important in all the music and movies and video games I came across. So much so that I'm still discovering places where Rompler pads made their mark. This video is about Rompler pads and how much I love them. I've recorded over 4 hours of pads from synths like the Korg M1, the Korg Triton, the Roland JV1080, the JD800, and the Emu Proteus. I've also recorded pads from some of my favorite modern Romplers, like the Wavestation, Prophet X, and Yamaha Montage. Shout out to Zounds for helping me get that in the studio. I also reached out to some friends who are using Romplers in their music, writing for video games, rocking the hell out of shows. We'll hear from Dale North and Floor Baba about their love for Romplers and how they're using them in their music. I'm going to play you some pads and talk about what made each of these Romplers special, how they worked, and anything else that seems fun along the way. This is a love letter to Rompler pads. Let's get started. So we'll want to get some definitions nailed down before we start listening to pads. First, what is a Rompler? The term Rompler is a portmanteau of ROM, or read-only memory, and sampler. Romplers typically use pre-recorded samples stored in ROM rather than allowing users to record and manipulate their samples as traditional samplers do. They generally have controls for normal synthesizer things like volume envelopes, but not always. Some have filters, some have effects, some don't. Some let you layer multiple samples from ROM, and some combine samples with other synthesis techniques. We will not be talking about devices that let you sample, like the Emu emulator. Instead, we'll be focusing on synths that only play back samples from ROM. I also won't be covering every Rompler ever made, including some of the newer ones like Omnisphere and Nexus. I'll be covering the ones I have access to via hardware or software. Okay, so what's a pad? Pads are sustained notes or chord progressions that carry tonal information. A pad can be a synthesized string section, a choir, whatever you want it to sound like. Sometimes a pad can even act as a lead, like in this Boards of Canada track, where outside the bass line and drums, the pad takes up the rest of the frequency spectrum and harmonic duties. Flume and other future bass and neo R&B artists will sometimes use pads in a more rhythmic way through sidechaining or other programming techniques. And here is an example of strings being used as pad chords that I cooked up. Any instrument can be used to create pad sounds if it's sustained and adds to the harmonic or musical content of a piece of music. If you want to make a very simple pad for yourself, load up your favorite synth. Turn the attack and release up on your envelope. This will give the sound a soft fade in and release. You don't need to do this, but it's a great place to start. So the waveform you choose will determine the brightness of your pad. Using a triangle wave or sine wave will keep it mellow but uninteresting. Choose a harmonically rich wave and temper it with a low-pass filter. Add a swelling envelope to your low-pass filter too. I also recommend adding reverb and delay. So now you have a basic subtractive pad. Choosing different waveforms or wavetables and moving through them will add interest to your pad. Some pads only need one note held down to tell their entire story. Experiment with different filters, waveforms, samples, and modulation to make your pad unique. Okay, now that we know what Romplers and pads are, we can get started with the rest of the video. Don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoy it, subscribe for more stuff like this. Also, if you want, you can support the channel at patreon.com/meansrecording, where I'll be releasing the almost 4 hours of pad sounds I recorded for this video as a treat. Thanks for your support. Now, more pads. The ensoniq ESQ1. Let's start with the earliest one on my list, the ensoniq ESQ1. I had actually put the Kurzweil K250 here and sampled it, but it wasn't just a rompler, it was a sampler too, so it goes in the trash. I'm going to break that rule later, so, I don't even know why I'm following it now. Produced from 1986 to 1988, the ESQ1 was a highly affordable synthesizer from ensoniq that featured a mixture of digital oscillators, ROM samples, and analog filters. Each of the 8 voices could feature up to 3 digital oscillators, and you could mix and match the waveforms and ROM samples, which is a hallmark of getting some of the coolest sounds from these boxes. The synth was multi-timbral, and you could use its onboard sequencer to play back up to 8 tracks of patterns or songs. Actually, you could get 9 sounds out of it, as one additional internal or cartridge-based sound could be used independently. Commercial cartridges came with 2 sets of 4 banks of voices each, but there are also blank or rewritable cartridges. Notable users of the ESQ1 include Steve Roach, Jean-Michel Jarre, Steve Wilson of Porcupine Tree, and Skinny Puppy. This synth still rocks today, but I would definitely run it through some effects. For better or worse, the only version I could find for this video, the UVI version of the synth, the USQ1, loads most of the presets up with effects. Roland D50. Only to the second synth in our list, and we've landed on an absolute legend. The Roland D50 was produced from 1987 to 1991. It features what Roland called digital linear arithmetic synthesis and boasted 16 voices in normal mode or 8 voices per split in split mode. It was 16-part multi-timbral, and you could actually access each voice on a separate MIDI channel if you wanted to. The D50 was the Yamaha DX7's biggest competition and is one of the best-selling synthesizers of all time. Between its sound and relatively easier to program interface, it estimated it sold hundreds of thousands of units. The linear arithmetic engine, or LA engine, combined elements of subtractive and additive synthesis and with sampled waveforms. It featured 16-bit digital oscillators that create the basic waveforms, and each oscillator was a series of partials consisting of its waveform, its harmonic content, and its own envelope generator. They called their envelopes TVA, or time variant amplifiers, instead of VCAs or ADSRs, just to be extra. A standout feature of the D50 was how it used sampled attack transients. The initial transient of many instruments is the hardest thing to get right in synthesis, and while the FM synthesis of the DX7 got closer by being able to produce a burst of inharmonic content at the start of a sound, it couldn't hold a candle to the sampled transients of the D50. Also, I swear to God, if you get up in my mentions calling the DX7 a phase distortion synth or a fucking rompler, I will come to your house and change all of your internet passwords. The D50 was insanely popular, featured in too many soundtracks and songs to list them all, but some notable examples include Enya's Orinoco Flow, Jean-Michel Jarre's Rendezvous, Depeche Mode's Enjoy the Silence, and maybe even the kalimba sound in Toto's Africa. It remains a banger to this day, and you can use it as part of the Roland Cloud subscription or track down one of the Roland Boutique DO5s, which I hugely regret selling. The Roland V-Synth XT can load a card that emulates the D50 as well. Korg M1. Wow, from the D50 to the Korg M1. Not sure we should have peaked this early, but here we are. The Korg M1 was produced from 1988 to 1995 and is, again, one of the best-selling synthesizers in history, selling an estimated 250,000 units. It was massive in dance music and defined an entire generation of house tunes. To say the organ bass and the M1 piano sounds are iconic is like saying Bowser has a fat ass. It just undersells it completely. The M1 is a 16-voice digital synth with 16 oscillators and a digital filter. It could run multi-timbrally with up to 8 parts. It featured 4 megabytes of ROM filled with 144 multi-sampled sounds. It had a digital filter, the VDF, or non-resonant variable digital low-pass filter. They must have been smoking the same shit as Roland was at the time because they called their VCA a VDA, variable digital amplifier, and it had 3 independent AAD-BBSSRR envelopes. That's right, not attack, decay, sustain, release like a normal boy. We're talking attack, initial decay, sustain decay, breakpoint, sustain level, second decay, and release. It's just absurd. I love it. The Korg M1 was filled with effects and a sequencer, aftertouch, and velocity-sensitive keyboard. It was a smash hit and featured in songs like Robin S.'s Show Me Love, CeCe Peterson's Finally, Rhythm is a Dancer by Snap. Oh my God, so many. 808 State, Pacific State, that's one that's just not the M1 piano. CNC Music Factory, Gonna Make You Sweat, that is the piano. Crystal Waters, Gypsy Woman, that's the piano too. Madonna's Vogue, that's the piano and the organ sample. Yeah, like, you know, you're going to remember the M1 for the piano, the organ, and the string sound that defined house music for a generation, but it has some of the most amazing pads and soundscapes I've heard in a synth, past or present. This synth is a gem, and you can grab the Korg Legacy Collection VST version to try it for yourself. I love it to death. Now that we know about some of the absolute classics like the D50 and M1, let's head on over and talk to Dale North about his love for Romplers and how he uses them to compose for video game music.
Hey, I'm Dale North, a video game music composer from San Diego, and I've made music for several dozen video games now. And the one common thread through all of them is that they use Romplers. I use Romplers because I grew up and I learned on them. Things like the Roland Sound Canvas and the Yamaha XG sound set. Later, the JV XP boxes from Roland. And I use them because I love them. I love the immediacy and the feel. And I love how reliably I can count on a certain box to fill one way or another in my work. But most of all, I love the vibe. And so whether it be a teeny project or a huge budget thing, there's no way I'm not going to use my favorite Romplers in the project. You know, things like what you would call the Korg Legacy Collection, but IRL. And in another rack, I have some of the rare pieces that really have no plug-in counterpart, like the SY77 and the EX5R. And then I have a huge stack of sound canvases and their other brand counterparts. And every one of these are in all of my work. And hopefully I'll continue using these until they need to be recapped or replaced. But I can't imagine doing work without them.
Kurzweil K1000. We left the K250 off the list at the start because it could sample, so Kurzweil did us a solid and released the K1000 in 1988. This Rompler had most of the samples that made the K250 famous, 24 notes of polyphony, and was 16-part multi-timbre. The samples were really the big deal with the K1000. The K250 samples were famous, and there was a popular rumor that the samples were recorded using members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Ooh, fancy. You could stack layers of what Kurzweil called sound files into a program. A sound file consisted of sampled waveforms like a piano or string, or a digitally produced waveform like a sine, saw, triangle, or square. You could layer these into a program with effects to get complex sounding patches. You would be forced to harness all that power, though, on one of the smallest screens I've ever seen. You think menu diving is bad today, look what these poor idiots had to deal with. There were tons of expansions for the K1000, which became pretty normal for Romplers, including ROM carts for horns, strings, guitars, and more. Despite being hard to use, the K1000 had some serious pedigree in popular music. It's all over Nine Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine and the Downward Spiral, early Depeche Mode, Enya, and even Pink Floyd. These days, if I wanted this sound, I would reach for the UVI version of the K1000, which we are doing here.
ensoniq VFX.
Look at this handsome devil. The colors, that teal, the white and the brushed metal, the logo, the tasteful thickness of it. This is a cool synth for cool people. Released in 1989, the ensoniq VFX used transwave wavetable synthesis, also found in the Fizz. And akin to the PPJ wave and Waldorf microwave. Since the VFX didn't actually have a resonant filter, you could use certain wavetables, certain scannable wavetables, to emulate a resonant filter by scanning through a specific shape. Check out my video on the Groove Synthesis third wave for demos and the history behind that tech. You could scan through an acoustic waveform to create the semblance of an acoustic instrument it was sampled from. This was a popular alternative to the sample transient of the D50. It had dual multimode digital filters, non-resonant, and 3 11-stage envelopes. 11 stages. We thought the M1's AA DBB SSRR envelope was bad. No, honey. Now we gotta deal with the DAB DBD SBBRBR, or delay, attack, breakpoint 1, decay 1, breakpoint 2, decay 2, sustain, breakpoint 3, release 1, breakpoint 4, release 2. The VFX has 21 voices with 1 to 6 oscillators per voice, 24-bit effects, and was followed by a version with a professional sequencer and added drum sounds. You'll find it used by John Hammer in his work on the Miami Vice soundtrack, Tangerine Dream, Kraftwerk, Enya, and tons of film and television soundtracks. These days, if I wanted to use one, I would reach for the UVI one we're listening to here. Emu. Finally, we get to the sense that provoked me to make this video, and honestly the biggest disappointment of the whole group I tested. Emu was a huge deal in the 1980s, releasing the incredible and incredibly expensive emulator series of sampler synthesizers. But by the late 1980s, Japan was dominating the market with things like the Roland D50 and the Korg M1. Emu needed a win, and they needed to focus on making more affordable synths. They took the sample library of the emulator 3, chopped it up, and sliced it into fragments that could be loaded into sets of 4 or 8 megabytes of ROM. They took a cue from the D50, which combines PCM samples as transients followed by synthesis, and delivered us their famous rompler, the Proteus. The Proteus line started in 1989 with the Proteus 1, featuring presets designed for pop and rock. It was followed up by the 1XR in 1990, the 1 Plus Orchestral in 1990, the 2 and 2XR the same year, the 3 and 3XR in 91, and the Proteus Effects in 1994. The second generation Proteus modules are where I started paying attention, with their bright colors and evocative names. Starting in 1993, we got the Vintage Keys and Morpheus modules, followed by the Ultra Proteus in 1994, Planet Fat for hip hop in 1997, and the Orbit for techno and electronica in 1996. The line continued with various iterations, including the absolutely disgustingly cool-looking XL7 and MP7 command station groove boxes, until 2003, ending with the Proteus 2500, at which point Emu continued to focus on software-based products and exited the hardware synthesizer market. I had an Orbit rack for a bit and meant to multi-sample it, but then I realized a ton of people already had, so I just went and bought those instruments. There are a few ways to get these sounds today without hardware, but I'm not very impressed by any of them. These versions I got for Kontakt via digitalsoundfactory.com are probably true to the originals, but they don't hit like the other synths on this list, and I didn't hear the level of polish on the pads here as I do on something like the M1 or the Roland JV1080. There was a big enough market on these to keep Emu in business long enough to eventually be bought out by Creative, but I would reach for the D50 before any of them, unless I'm trying to make that one X-Files sound. That whistle is straight from the Proteus 2. Good old Whistlin' Joe. First produced in the early 1990s, the wavestation uses what Korg called vector synthesis and wave sequencing to create complex sample-based patches. It honestly sounds great, but is one of the most absurdly difficult to program synths I've ever encountered. Even the Korg Wavestate, released in 2020, and the Wavestate Native, the VST version of it, are like pulling teeth to me, which is a shame because when the Wavestation family hits right, it knocks it out of the park. Vector synthesis was a fancy way of saying crossfading. Any 2 to 4 oscillator patch on the Wavestation family can be mixed in various ratios using dedicated mix envelopes, in real time using the front panel's joystick or with LFOs, aftertouch, and MIDI. The synthesis engine was based on the AI synthesis system used in the M1 family and the following T-series synths. The original Wavestation had 32 voice polyphony, up to 4 digital oscillators per patch, a non-resonant low-pass filter, and a controllable amplifier for each oscillator. It also had 2 DSP effect blocks, which helped it feel alive and deep. Wave sequencing was the other big selling point of the Wavestation, and this is where the programming aspect gets fucky. At its simplest, a wave sequence is a list of PCM waves playing in succession. Each step in the sequence can have a different duration, pitch, tuning, level, and crossfade amount. The sequences can play forward, backwards, loop, or play for a finite duration, and can be clocked or unclocked. On paper, this sounds amazing, at the level of like modular synthesizers for the complexity of a patch, and some of the presets are astoundingly beautiful. But programming this on a synth is a nightmare. It wasn't made any better by the Wavestate, and looking at the VST for the Wavestate Native will show you a little what I mean. It's just kind of inscrutable. I still think it's worth picking up the Korg Legacy Collection edition of the Wavestate VST for the nostalgia of some of these presets, which were truly groundbreaking. The new Wavestate VST is also worth checking out. I mean, listen to this pad. This should be illegal, it's so beautiful. Roland JD800. If the Emu Proteus line was the biggest disappointment on this list, the JD800 was the biggest pleasant surprise. I had always assumed this beautiful bean was a simple virtual analog or even a fancy analog like the equally striking Alesis Andromeda, but oh boy, I was wrong. The JD800 is a 24-voice, 6-part multi-timbral ROM-based digital synthesizer. It was produced between 1991 and 1993 and has a huge pedigree of famous artists associated with it, including William Orbit, 808 State, Astral Projection, Underworld, Faithless, and a lot more. The sounds are based on the D50 but updated for the 90s with a multi-mode filter and tons of hand-on control. It boasted 3 megabytes of PCM ROM with 108 waveforms, plus 1 megabyte expansion cards that included drums, strings, and one completely dedicated to accordion, because fuck you. It uses the same linear arithmetic synthesis employed by the D50 and was the first of Roland's instruments to have its core presets developed entirely in the US as opposed to Japan. The core sampled waveforms and factory presets were created by Eric Persing, who went on to found a little company called Spectrasonics, who you may know as the creators of Omnisphere. Eric is what we like to call in the synthesizer business a bit of a chat. Each patch in the synth contained up to 4 tones, and each tone could be considered its own independent synthesizer voice. When using only one tone, you could have up to 24 voices of polyphony, and when using all 4 tones, you got up to 6 voices of polyphony. There were dedicated layer buttons for turning on and off each tone, and you could mix them in edit mode using the sliders. Also, how cool are sliders on synths? The answer is the most cool. I was blown away by the pads on the JD800 VST from Roland's Cloud. It's a shame it's only available through the subscription service, but definitely worth checking out because, like the D50, this thing absolutely slays in the pad department. There's also a hardware boutique version, but I've read it loses all the ease of programming the original had. Still, the sound is on point, and the Brother Tiger expansion for the VST is good enough to base an entire album around.
Roland JV1080.
From one Roland juggernaut to another, the JV1080 is a 64-voice, 16-part multi-timbral beast. It was produced from 1994 to 2001, and was a huge hit with musicians of all kinds, but especially film composers who appreciated its high-quality sounds and multi-timbrality. While not fully confirmed, it's said to have been used in movies like Titanic, The Matrix, and The Fifth Element. It was likely used in tons of shows and video games too, including rumors that it was used for Final Fantasy VII's iconic soundtrack. Point is, this is a really influential synth, and it happens to have great pads. It featured 8 megabytes of ROM sounds on board and was expandable with up to 4 expansion cards and 2 data cards. Up to 42 megabytes of sounds total were possible by adding any of the JV80 expansion cards, available in a wide variety of genres. I remember encountering the next iteration of this one, the JV2080, in my first and only year of flute performance college. It was in the studio on campus, and as somebody who was super interested in synthesizers but only knew software synths up until that point, it seemed really alien and arcane to me. I actually didn't like the sounds that came out of it then, finding them kind of limp and cheesy, but like a fine wine or cheese, I have grown to love a lot of the sounds that the series makes, especially the pads. As an aside, I once snuck onto the on-campus studio with a friend's key and stayed there all night to mess with the equipment and try to make music with the JV2080. And then when the professor came in the morning, he caught me there, and I was banned from ever using the studio again. And that's how I met your mother. I actually didn't realize until researching this video that the JV1080 was based on the same architecture as the D50, but it makes perfect sense. Oh right, remember Eric Persing from the JD800 and Spectrasonics? Yeah, he made many of the most well-known factory presets and expansion board sounds for this box too. Mega Chad. You can get one of these as hardware now for as little as $250 used, and I know a lot of people into Romplers that have a bunch of the Roland rack lineup. They're great. I'll stick with the Roland Cloud version you've been listening to here. This is an iconic synth, and it's worth checking out. Now that we're even more knowledgeable about Romplers and their significance, let's head over and talk to Floor Baba about their use of Romplers in their music.
Hello, my name is Jesse, also known as Floor Baba. I am an experimental electronic music composer, sometimes for games. I typically write in the jazz fusion sort of realm. So I'm very honored to be asked by Jeremy to be a part of this video because Romplers are something that I'm a bit passionate about, and I own several. I have a JV1080 behind me here. I have a EMU Orbit 9090. I have an EMU Proteus 2000, I have a Roland D110, and I have a Korg M3R. And I'd like to give a special shout out to the Roland D05, the D50 boutique version. This was actually the first synthesizer that I bought, and it's because I recognized some of the sounds. I actually got my start in chiptune and in video game composing. And one thing that really intrigued me about the Super Nintendo and the N64 were that they were sample-based music formats. So you have a sample, and then you have a loop point, and then that loop point allows that sound to go on for infinity. So this is actually different than the systems that came before them. The Nintendo was an 8-bit synthesizer. The Sega Genesis was a 16-bit FM synthesizer. So then you have the Super Nintendo and the N64. Those are sample-based instruments, tiny samples inside of instruments with loop points. So I got to thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we could write new music using these old samples? There's a whole scene of very talented artists and programmers who are taking the sounds from the ROMs of the game and putting them into formats that are easily read by modern DAWs. I was one of those people. And it was through that first scene that I started to get familiar with sounds that were popping up in multiple places. And then I got to wondering, where are these sounds coming from? The short answer is they're coming from audio sources of the day. Sample CDs, they would be synthesizers, and they would be Romplers. Without getting too far in the weeds here, you can actually find photos of those game composers of the day, like Koji Kondo, and go through the photo and see the different rack mount equipment that they had at their disposal. So as I got older and more financially stable, knock on wood, I was able to afford some of these old Romplers. And now, in my modern music, I use them to great effect, I believe. Something I'm big about is retrofuturism, so finding things from the past and recontextualizing them today, imagining a future where those things continued developing. In my own music, I like to call upon feelings of nostalgia and then use that as a vessel to carry you into new places. I don't want to just sit in nostalgia soup. I find that machines like the JV1080 have the ability to pull you back in time with just a simple sound. And for that reason, I use them quite frequently. They're also just like any other piece of music equipment. You keep it around, you allow it to inspire you and give you new ideas and to help you find new expressions. That's what we're in this for. Expression, art, making things, conveying messages. It's not just an aesthetics box. It can still speak. So a couple examples are something that I was working on just the other day, actually, with this setup I have right here, this kind of JV1080 island that I'm working with right now. So annoying. There's trains near me and they shake all my equipment. And another example is my song Death Trap, which was a single off of my most recent full-length album Prehistory, and that is written almost entirely with the JV1080. I actually just dropped it live main stage at MagFest. And I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty cool. So that's kind of my moment with these machines and where I come from with them. I think that they're really interesting pieces of music history, and it's so cool because you can play with that history. Thanks so much for having me, and go stream Prehistory.
Korg Triton. Considered a workstation synth as much as an incredibly advanced Rompler, the Korg Triton was Korg's flagship workstation from 1999 to 2007. The technology and sound was so good, it spun off 9 variants, including the Korg Karma, which I still have a perverse attraction to, and the Triton Extreme without force in 2004. It featured 62 notes of polyphony, 32 megabytes of ROM, dual polyphonic arpeggiators, onboard sampling. Wait, hold on. Onboard sampling? Oh, God damn it. That means it technically doesn't belong here. Look, just forget I said that, okay? I really want to tell you about the Triton, so just, forget that, okay? Okay, the synth engine was dubbed hyper-integrated, or HI synthesis. It had improved multi-samples over its predecessor, the Trinity, 5 insert effects per program, dual filters per oscillator that could be in a variety of configurations, and could even be expanded with a multi-timbral and polyphonic version of the Moss engine found in the Korg Prophecy, which is another really cool synth worth checking out. As a workstation, it included a serious sequencer with up to 16 tracks and 100 patterns per song, and 200 songs. The arpeggiator wasn't just like up-down variations either. It had pattern recording, and playback could be used polyphonically. All of this led to some truly magnificent presets, especially with the pads and motion synths. While pads are the bread and butter of this video, the motion synth category, or music effects category on the Yamaha we'll talk about later, sometimes contains super complex patches with layered pads and rhythmic content that I absolutely adore. The Triton had cards that could be installed to expand the sounds, including piano and keys, loops, orchestral sounds, and one for trance. At this point in the game, with a synth this complex, the use cases of it are so expansive, it's hard to nail down every example of its use in popular culture, but there are some pretty notable examples. Crazy in Love by Beyonce, Drop It Like It's Hot by Snoop Dogg, Family Affair by Mary J. Blige, Hey Ya by Outkast. There's just too many. There's just too many good tracks made with this thing. You can pick up a used Korg Triton rack for about $400 or a used 61 key version for about $700 these days, but I'm going to stick with the VST version I got from the Korg Legacy Collection. Roland XV5080. Using Vintage Synth Explorer for research for this video is funny because a lot of the articles are written as if it's the date the device was originally released, like a press release. So here's what they say about the Roland XV5080 in the year 2000.
The Roland XV5080 128 voice synthesizer module is the ultimate sound module, based on the best sounding, most expressive and expandable new synthesizer/sample playback architecture in Roland history. With a massive 128 voices, it's capable of extensive layering and multi-timbral applications! There are true stereo waveforms per tone, expressive matrix control, expandability with 4 expansion slots for the 64MB SRX series waveboards, and 4 SR-JV80 expansion slots. The sounds include those from the JV2080, plus many more new sounds and waveforms from the JD990 and the Super JD.
So yeah, this is like a bunch of the best of Roland Rompler synthesizers plus extra. It has the 1080 we talked about earlier inside, plus the 2080, and a bunch of older Roland synths. And yeah, it was released in 2000. Under the hood, the 64 megabytes of ROM gives 1,083 waveforms, and it was expandable with the SR-JV80 series wave expansion boards and the XP-JV series patches with up to 4 slots. One super interesting thing about the XV5080 was its ability to read Akai sample libraries, something that Native Instruments Kontakt used to be able to do but dropped a few versions back, which opens a huge amount of content that's otherwise difficult to get working in 2024. They continued to use the linear arithmetic engine of the D50 alongside virtual analog modeling and PCM waveforms, and included a comprehensive selection of high-quality effects, reverbs, chorus, delays, more. These effects can be applied to both individual sounds and entire mixes, allowing for detailed sound sculpting and processing. This thing really had it all. One nice feature introduced in the JV2080 was being able to search for sounds based on category, something that's incredibly useful on a synth with 1,152 factory patches. The XV5080 sounds great, don't get me wrong, but I think I appreciate the sound of the D50 or the JD800 more. That said, it's almost worth picking up on the used market just for that Akai sample CD integration. You can use the XV5080 today as part of the Roland Cloud subscription, and hey, Roland, please, just let us buy these. Just let us buy the VSTs, please. Please.
Yamaha motif.
Okay, so you're probably saying, yo, Jeremy, what the heck? That's not a motif, that's a montage. Yeah, well, you're half right. There's a whole category on this puppy that's just motif sounds, and that's cool as hell. I got the montage specifically to show off in this video as a modern rompler, but I didn't realize it was going to have all the motif sounds in there too, so thanks, Yamaha. Also, shout out to Zounds for helping me get the montage in the studio. Check the video description for a link to them. The Yamaha Motif came out in 2001, and like the Triton and Trinity, was a flagship workstation synth. It features 62 voices of polyphony, 84 megabytes of waveform ROM, the AWM2 sample playback engine, and in the montage you can see that most, if not all, the motif patches are designated AWM2 patches. It did have a sampler. The montage has a sampler too. Look, just, you know what? It's just, look, there's also a 16-track sequencer and a 256 pattern arpeggiator with 128 user slots for your own. High-quality multi-effects make the sample sound nice, and Yamaha's Mega Voice tech applied things like hammer-ons, ghost notes, slides, and fret noises depending on how hard you hit a key. This is stuff that we take for granted now in things like Kontakt, but it was a really huge deal back then. Like the Triton, there were rack units and upgrades for the motif, and it was used in a ton of different kinds of music. but maybe, most famously, producer Timbaland used a Motif ES7. You can get a used Motif today for between $600 and $1,400, depending on which model and how many keys. The montage, which I'm using here, is considerably more expensive, but after going through most of the presets, it's also equally impressive. Native Instruments Kontakt. Native Instruments Kontakt is a rompler. Well, actually, it's a rampler. It loads samples into your RAM, and they live on your hard drive, which also isn't ROM. Look, the functionality is basically the same. Shut up and let me talk about it, okay? Native Instruments released Kontakt V1 in 2002. Since then, it's grown up both in scope, popularity, and capability, and V7 released in 2023. It brought the biggest innovation I've ever seen in a piece of software like this, and that was putting a store in the plugin. Cool. Despite that, I am a Kontakt advocate, and the sheer volume of insanely amazing instruments made for it is baffling. I have made videos playing one Kontakt instrument pads for an hour, and that's not even the best sounding pad instrument I have now. The reason things like Kontakt and Falcon are so powerful is the framework behind building instruments for them. Not only do you get to work at insanely high sample rates and sample lengths, you have access to scripting for incredible velocity sensitivity, articulation switching, expressive fading between samples, and high-density round robining, where the same note played after the same note results in a slightly different sample. While I'm spending this entire video gushing over hardware sample playback devices, nothing will match what dedicated software instruments can do. Kontakt is my beloved for scoring, pads, weird electroacoustic instruments, drums, guitars, and more.
Sequential Prophet X.
Kontakt is my beloved, but that said, if I had to pick one hardware rompler that would contend with the ingenuity of Kontakt, it would be my Sequential Prophet X. This synth was released in 2018, and I feel like I got slept on in a major way. Maybe it was the eye-watering price tag. Maybe it was the fact that software could do what it did better. I'm not sure, but I am so glad I was able to snag one used because it's become one of my favorite go-tos for live, weird electroacoustic sound design. The Prophet X features 8 voice polyphony through analog filters or 16 voices with no filters. That also may have been something that hung people up. It's pretty low polyphony. Each layer has 2 instruments and 2 digital oscillators that you can mix together, and you can actually amplitude modulate and frequency modulate samples with oscillators and vice versa, which is awesome. Each patch can be a stack between 2 layers, or you can split them. The sample library on this is extensive, with some beautiful sounding multi-sampled acoustic instruments and some really weird stuff too. There's tons of pits percussion, weird spoken voices, pads and effects that you can stretch across the keys if you want. You can loop samples, modulate the loops, and get really interesting semi-granular stuff out of it. You can also stack layers with different arpeggiators and sequences to get really dense motion pads. While the montage is undeniably more capable, there's something weird and raw about the Prophet X. It's arguably more easy to understand as it's virtually one knob per function, and that makes making weird patches on it more fun. The only real downside, besides the price, are the effect engines. I've actually never been a fan of Sequential's effects, and the thing that sucks is if you don't like them, you're not going to like them on every synth, since they're virtually the same on every DSI product. If Sequential teamed up with Arturia and gave us the effect block from the Mini Freak, I would be in heaven. Oh, and the presets absolutely stink for the cinematic possibility of this thing, so hey Sequential, hire me. That said, the Prophet X is truly a special synth carrying on the rich tradition of romplers making amazing sounds with little effort.
Korg Modwave.
I'd like to give a shout out to what I think is the coolest of the bunch of synths that Korg put out recently, the Modwave. This is a hybrid synth with wavetables and PCM engines, where each part can be a mixture of both, and you can stack 2 parts together, not unlike the Prophet X. There are some truly stellar sounds capable with this thing, and it's not hard to program like the Wave State. I was really impressed with the library of potential wavetables and samples on this, with some of the multi-sampled sounds rivaling software instruments. The Modwave is also available as a VST, Modwave native, as you can see here, and don't sleep on this one. It is rad. And that, my friends, is my video on Rompler pads. Did we bend the rules a little bit? Hell yeah, we did. Did we leave some Romplers out of the video? Hell yeah, we did. But now I get to ask you, which is your favorite Rompler? Engage with me in the comments. Let me know. Do you have a favorite Rompler pad? Let me know. Give me that sweet engagement. I hope you can see why I love the sounds of these machines. There's something incredibly nostalgic to me about that period of synth history where we moved from the humble analog waveform to reach for the stars, utilizing true ingenuity to start bringing the real world into our patches, and in the process, creating the most beautiful uncanniness that is the Rompler pad. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my patrons for helping make this video possible. Shout out to Zounds for helping me with the montage, and shout out to my Discord for having more collective Rompler knowledge than most online forums. I hope you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane and beyond. Get it? Memory? ROM? Read-only memory? My name is Jeremy. This is Red Means Recording, and I hope you have a wonderful day.